You know, it seems like we haven't seen each other for 20 years. And I ran out of air and words. And Dean jumps up on the stage. Jerry Lewis and Dean Martin. Once the duo America couldn't take its eyes off for over a decade. They were the faces of laughter, the guaranteed formula behind every sold-out theater, every hit television show, and every box office success in Hollywood. 7 years have passed since the world said goodbye to legendary comedian Jerry Lewis. He left behind an extraordinary legacy of laughter, philanthropy, and unforgettable performances. But behind the glitz of Hollywood, the public adoration was a darker, more complicated family story. For years, Jerry's son stayed quiet, refusing to speak about his father or the wounds left behind. Now, for the first time, he breaks his silence, and what he reveals changes everything we thought we knew about the man behind the comedy mask. Jerry Lewis was a titan of American comedy. From his groundbreaking partnership with Dean Martin to his solo career, filled with iconic slapstick performances, he was adored by millions. He raised millions for charity through his Muscular Dystrophy Association telethons, earning the image of a caring, selfless man who gave endlessly to others. But behind that public image, his family tells a very different story. Jerry married singer Patty Palmer in 1944, and together they had 6 sons. To the outside world, they seemed like the perfect family of Hollywood's golden age, a hard-working father, a glamorous mother, and children growing up in the glow of fame. Yet, within the walls of their home, things were much colder. According to his son, Jerry's focus was almost entirely on his career. When he wasn't on stage or in front of the cameras, he was busy writing, producing, or planning his next move. As Jerry's son recalls, they were raised not by a doting father, but by nannies, teachers, and eventually by themselves. He describes Jerry as emotionally distant, someone who showed more affection to fans than to his own children. To the world, he was this generous man. To us, he was barely there. His son reveals the irony of Jerry being called America's dad on television, while his own children felt abandoned wasn't lost on them. Things worsened as Jerry's fame grew. With money and opportunity pouring in, he became even more focused on maintaining his place in the spotlight. At home, there was constant tension, often sparked by Jerry's temper and strict rules. His son recalls feeling like they were props in Jerry's image of a perfect family rather than being loved as individuals. The family dinners, when they happened at all, were often filled with arguments or silence. Perhaps most heartbreaking is the contrast his son points out. The man who raised billions for sick children could not find a way to emotionally connect with his own. His son explains that as a boy, he often wondered why the kids Jerry helped on television seemed to get more kindness than he did in private. As Jerry's career soared, the cracks in his family life grew deeper. Patty eventually divorced him in 1980 after decades of unhappiness, and the sons were left with scars that never fully healed. Now, 7 years after Jerry's passing, one of those sons admits that much of his life was spent struggling with feelings of neglect, anger, and confusion over why his father could give so much to the world, but so little to his own family. For years, this pain was buried, kept behind closed doors out of loyalty to the Lewis name and the weight of Jerry's fame. But now, his son says, it's time the world knows the truth. Jerry Lewis's public image was crafted to perfection. On screen, he was the goofy genius, the eternal clown who made audiences laugh until they cried. Offstage, he was the philanthropic showman, the man who gave his time and energy to children suffering from muscular dystrophy. But behind that curtain, his son says, lived a man torn apart by ego, control, and the relentless need for admiration. In his first real interview since Jerry's passing, his son explained how fame seemed to consume his father entirely. Everything was about Jerry, he said bluntly. The rest of us were just extras in his movie. While fans and Hollywood colleagues adored him, Jerry reportedly demanded perfection at home. He was quick-tempered and sometimes cruel, with little patience for mistakes. Even as children, his sons felt as though they were employees, expected to obey rather than be nurtured. Money was never the issue. The Lewis household lived in luxury, but love, attention, and understanding were in short supply. His son remembers birthdays without his father present, milestones ignored, and achievements dismissed as unimportant compared to Jerry's next big film or television appearance. The resentment grew quietly, turning what should have been a bond between father and child into a rift that widened year after year. His son also reveals that Jerry's complicated relationships with women played a role in the dysfunction. Jerry's marriage to Patty Palmer was filled with turbulence. Patty, a talented singer herself, reportedly gave up much of her own career to support her husband. But as Jerry's fame grew, so did rumors of affairs, ego clashes, and a controlling personality that strained their marriage. Patty once described Jerry as a man who lived for the audience, not for his family. The divorce in 1980 left the Lewis household shattered. The children, already distant from their father, suddenly found themselves caught in the fallout of a bitter separation. According to his son, Jerry made little effort to repair the fractured relationships with his boys afterward. He built his empire, his son explained, but he left his family in ruins. Adding to the tension was Jerry's notorious reputation for being difficult in Hollywood. While his comedic brilliance was undeniable, he was also known for being arrogant, often clashing with producers, co-stars, and even friends. His son believes this same personality carried over into his private life. Dad had to be the center of everything. If you weren't part of his spotlight, you were nothing. These memories became even harder to bear when Jerry's generosity was paraded in public. His annual telethons raised billions for charity, making him a hero to millions. Yet his children rarely saw that same compassion at home. His son recalls watching his father cry on live television for sick children and wondering why those same tears never fell for him. The emotional distance was compounded by harsh discipline. Jerry reportedly demanded respect, but rarely offered kindness in return. Small mistakes were met with anger, and affection was almost non-existent. "I don't remember hearing him say, 'I love you,'" his son admits. Not once. By the time Jerry entered his later years, the damage to his relationship with his sons seemed irreversible. Several of them publicly criticized their father even before his death, calling him cruel and dismissive. Jerry himself made headlines when it was revealed that he had cut all 6 of his sons from his first marriage out of his will, leaving his estate instead to his second wife and their adopted daughter. To the world, this move seemed shocking. But to his sons, it was confirmation of what they had felt all along, that they had been written out of his life long before they were written out of his will. "We weren't expecting anything," his son admits. "But it showed exactly how he felt about us. We were never his family. We were just his responsibility." 7 years later, speaking with both bitterness and sadness, Jerry's son says he doesn't share his story to tarnish his father's legacy, but to reveal the man behind the mask. "He wanted the world to believe he was this saint," he said. "But for us, he was a stranger in our own home." Growing up as Jerry Lewis's son wasn't a golden ticket to success. It was a lifelong shadow. While the name Lewis opened doors in Hollywood, it also carried expectations that were nearly impossible to meet. For Jerry's son, the world assumed he had been raised in privilege, bathed in love, and guided by a father who could teach him everything about comedy, show business, and life. The truth was far different. After his parents' divorce, the disconnect between Jerry and his children only deepened. His son recalls feeling invisible, abandoned, not only emotionally, but also financially. While Jerry lived in luxury and continued to build his career, his sons often struggled to get by. "People assumed we had it easy," his son said. But being Jerry Lewis's kid didn't mean you had support. It meant people expected you to live up to him, even though he was never around to help. The silence was deafening. For years, Jerry's son avoided speaking publicly about their fractured relationship. He watched as the media celebrated his father's achievements, praised his humanitarian efforts, and labeled him a national treasure. But inside, he carried the weight of resentment, wondering why no one ever questioned the cost of Jerry's brilliance at home. The burden of carrying a famous name also came with personal struggles. His son admits that his early adulthood was filled with mistakes, failed jobs, broken relationships, and at times despair. Living in the shadow of someone so iconic made it almost impossible to carve out an independent identity. "When people found out who my dad was, it was either admiration or judgment," he explained. "They wanted to know what it was like growing up with Jerry Lewis. And the truth was, I never knew how to answer because I never really grew up with him at all." The arrangement reached its most painful point when Jerry's will was revealed to the public. Not only had he excluded his 6 biological sons, but he had gone out of his way to state it explicitly. ensuring that no one could contest it. The cold legal document read like a final rejection, a permanent stamp that said his sons no longer mattered. It wasn't about money, his son clarified. It was about the message. Even after death, he wanted us to feel erased. Yet, despite the anger and bitterness, there was also silence. Jerry's son admits that for years after his father's passing, he chose not to speak out. Part of it was fear of backlash from Jerry's loyal fans who refused to believe he could be anything but the man they saw on stage. Another part was loyalty, a complicated form of respect for the man who, despite everything, was still his father. But silence took its toll. The unresolved pain, the unanswered questions, and the lingering scars made it impossible to fully move forward. Friends and family urged him to let it go, to accept that Jerry had chosen his path. Yet the wound remained open, and the burden grew heavier with each passing year. I stayed quiet because I didn't want to hurt his legacy, his son confessed. But the truth is, keeping it all inside only hurt me. His life since Jerry's death has been a mix of reflection and rebuilding. He has worked to step out of the shadow, to define himself on his own terms. But the scars of neglect and rejection run deep. He admits that even now, small things can trigger memories. A comedy clip, a fan praising his father, or even a rerun of a telethon where Jerry shed tears for strangers, but never for his own children. 7 years later, breaking his silence is not about revenge or bitterness. It's about release. I don't want to carry this pain forever, he says. I want people to know that Jerry Lewis wasn't just the man they saw on television. He was also a father who failed his kids. In sharing his truth, Jerry's son hopes to finally step out of the shadow of his father's legacy. Not as Jerry Lewis's son, but as his own man. 7 years after Jerry Lewis's passing, his son has finally chosen to speak, not out of spite, but out of necessity. For too long, he says, the story of Jerry Lewis was only told through one lens: the adoring public, the industry accolades, and the carefully curated legacy of a man who gave laughter to millions. But legacies, he insists, are complicated. And while Jerry may have been a comedy genius, he was also a flawed father whose choices left behind wounds his family still carries. In this final reflection, Jerry's son admits that coming forward has been both painful and freeing. Speaking about the neglect, the emotional distance, and the feeling of abandonment has reopened old scars, but it has also lifted a weight he has carried for decades. Silence protects the person who hurt you, he explained, but it destroys you from the inside. I can't stay silent anymore. The act of breaking his silence, however, doesn't erase the love he once hoped for. Deep down, there is still a part of him that wanted Jerry to be the father he needed. A part that wanted the hugs, the words of encouragement, and the acknowledgement that never came. That longing makes forgiveness difficult. People ask if I forgive him, his son said. The truth is, I don't know if I ever can. How do you forgive someone who never thought they did anything wrong? What complicates forgiveness even further is Jerry's public image. To millions, Jerry Lewis was untouchable, a man who gave endlessly of himself. Fans still write tributes, share old clips, and call him a national treasure. His son doesn't begrudge them their love for his father, but he does resent the assumption that Jerry was the same man in private. It's not about taking away what he gave to the world, his son clarified. It's about telling the truth of what he didn't give to his family. Still, there's no denying the influence Jerry had on his children, even in absence. His son acknowledges that much of his strength, the ability to endure hardship, to push forward despite obstacles, came from surviving life as Jerry Lewis's son. The shadow was heavy, but it also forced him to fight for his own identity. I had to learn the hard way, he said. You can't live waiting for someone else's approval, even if that person is your father. As he breaks his silence now, his hope is not to drag Jerry Lewis's name through the mud, but to bring balance to the narrative, to remind people that legends are still human and that the people closest to them often bear the cost of their fame. If my story makes even one person look closer at their own family, appreciate their children more, or step away from fame to focus on what matters, then it's worth telling, he said. In the end, what Jerry's son reveals is a story of loss of love, loss of connection, and loss of the chance to heal while Jerry was still alive. But it's also a story of survival. Despite the rejection, despite being erased from his father's will, Despite the years of silence, he has found his voice. And in telling his truth, he begins to reclaim what Jerry's shadow once took away, his own identity. 7 years later, the pain remains, but so does resilience. I will always be Jerry Lewis's son, he admits. That will never change. But for the first time, I get to be me too. And maybe that's the closure I've been looking for. The tragedy of Jerry Lewis is not just the story of a complicated man. It's also the story of the family he left behind. Children who grew up in the shadow of a legend, but longed for the love of a father. Now, as his son finally breaks his silence, the world sees Jerry Lewis not only as a star, but also as a flawed man whose brilliance came at a devastating cost.